February 1945. Deep inside the volcanic rock of Mount Suribachi, Japanese defenders endure an apocalyptic naval bombardment. By their calculations, no human force should survive this pre-invasion barrage, let alone the registered artillery kill zones waiting on the black sand below. But as the smoke clears, thousands of U.S. Marines hit the beaches. Through their narrow observation slits, the Japanese watch the landing force take catastrophic, devastating losses in a matter of minutes. Logically, an assault absorbing this level of punishment should break and pull back. Instead, the decimated Marine formations simply keep moving forward into the meat grinder. For the 21,000 men under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, this unrelenting advance shattered a core strategic assumption. They were ordered to fight a battle of annihilation, buried inside miles of volcanic tunnels with absolutely no hope of reinforcement or rescue. Their grim mandate was to bleed the assault force so severely that the political will in Washington would fracture. But surviving diaries, final letters, and internal dispatches reveal a profoundly different psychological collision. The defenders found themselves facing an industrial juggernaut that deployed unimaginable material wealth, limitless artillery, continuous air cover, and endless supply chain, yet remained terrifyingly willing to pay in blood for every yard of shattered rock. How does a doomed garrison, instructed to die in place specifically to break the enemy's spirit, comprehend a democratic army that absorbs staggering casualties without once stalling its momentum? To understand the genuine shock recorded by these underground defenders, we must first examine the elaborate trap they spent months engineering. A subterranean fortress designed entirely around the fatal belief that American troops lacked the psychological endurance for a protracted slaughter. To grasp the scale of the shock that awaited the Japanese garrison, we must first look at the architect of their defense, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Unlike many of his contemporaries in the Imperial High Command, Kuribayashi harbored no illusions about the enemy. Having served as a military attaché in the United States in the 1920s, he had personally witnessed the terrifying industrial capacity of the American automotive and aviation sectors. He knew that matching the Americans plane for plane or ship for ship was a mathematical impossibility. Consequently, when he took command of Iwo Jima in June 1944, he fundamentally rewrote the tactical manual of the Imperial Japanese Army. For years, standard Japanese defensive doctrine called for meeting the enemy directly at the water's edge and launching massive, screaming banzai charges to drive amphibious landings back into the sea. Kuribayashi explicitly banned this practice. He understood that throwing unarmored infantry at an invasion force backed by total naval and air supremacy was essentially just assisting the Americans in wiping out his own men. To him, an honorable suicide was a tactical waste. Every soldier's life had to be spent efficiently, extracting the maximum possible toll in American blood. Instead of a fragile perimeter on the beaches, Kuribayashi engineered one of the most sophisticated defensive networks in the history of modern warfare. Over the course of several months, his troops carved an intricate, massive subterranean fortress directly into the island's volcanic rock. Using hand tools and blasting charges, they excavated more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, linking thousands of deeply buried pillboxes, blockhouses, and artillery emplacements. The defense was concentrated in two main sectors, the heavily fortified Motoyama Plateau in the north and the imposing 550-foot dormant volcano, Mount Suribachi, at the southern tip. Nothing was left exposed on the surface if it could be buried. Artillery pieces were recessed in deep caves behind massive steel doors that could be rolled back just long enough to fire, then immediately sealed before American counter-battery fire could respond. The island itself was hollowed out, transformed from an 8-square-mile speck of ash in the Pacific into a heavily armored, invisible meat grinder. But the cost of building and manning this fortress was exacted entirely on the bodies and minds of the Japanese defenders. The 21,000 men stationed on Iwo Jima were permanently cut off from the rest of the empire. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been effectively neutralized at Leyte Gulf, meaning there would be no reinforcement, no naval support, and absolutely no hope of evacuation. The soldiers were completely aware that they were constructing their own tombs. Surviving diaries detail a grueling subterranean existence that bordered on the unbearable. Deep underground, geothermal vents raised the ambient temperature to a sweltering 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The stagnant air was thick with the suffocating stench of sulfur, turning the simple act of breathing into an exhausting chore. Because Iwo Jima had no natural fresh water sources, the men relied entirely on rainwater catchments, which quickly became contaminated by volcanic ash or simply ran dry. Rations were slashed to a single cup of water per day for drinking, washing, and preparing food. Dysentery and malnutrition ravaged the ranks months before the first American boot even touched the sand. Yet, despite the rapidly deteriorating physical conditions, Kuribayashi's strict discipline held the garrison together. They were bound by a grim, collective mandate. Each man was expected to kill 10 Americans before dying. Against this static, starving, doomed defense mechanism sailed an American amphibious force of unprecedented power. The United States Fifth Fleet brought over 800 ships, deploying a logistical chain that stretched unbroken across thousands of miles of ocean, straight back to the untouched factories of North America. The invading force boasted total air supremacy, allowing heavy bombers to strike the island with impunity for 74 consecutive days prior to the landings. This was a highly mobile, heavily armed assault force, brimming with mechanized armor, artillery, and an endless supply of fresh ammunition. The contrast was absolute. An invisible garrison digging deeper into the earth, waiting to clash with an industrial juggernaut that could seemingly replace any loss in a matter of hours. Yet, Kuribayashi was banking on one critical vulnerability: the political cost of human life. His subterranean trap was perfectly set. Every mortar tube, heavy machine gun, and anti-tank weapon was mathematically registered on the black sand beaches below. The firing angles were perfectly interlocked. As the morning of February 19th approached, his strict orders were disseminated through the tunnel network. The Japanese would hold their fire. They would sit in the sweltering dark, watch the initial waves land unopposed, and wait for the beaches to choke with men and machines. At 8:59 in the morning on February 19th, the first waves of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the black volcanic ash of the eastern beaches. From their heavily fortified observation posts, carved high into the slopes of Mount Suribachi and the northern plateaus, the Japanese defenders watched, and they waited in absolute, terrifying silence. For nearly an hour, the Marines poured ashore completely unopposed. Men and heavy equipment began to pile up on the steep terraces of loose volcanic sand, struggling to find traction. To the American planners offshore, it initially appeared that the massive naval bombardment had miraculously succeeded, annihilating the defenders before the battle had even begun. But Kuribayashi was simply letting the trap fill. When the landing zones were completely saturated with infantry, vehicles, and essential supplies, he finally gave the order. Suddenly, the side of the mountain erupted. Camouflaged steel doors slid open, and heavy artillery pieces rolled forward, firing directly down onto the exposed beaches before quickly rolling back into the rock. Hundreds of concealed mortars and interlocking machine gun nests unleashed a mathematically precise barrage onto grids that had been calculated months in advance. There was absolutely no cover for the Marines on the flat, featureless ash. The beachhead instantly transformed into an apocalyptic kill zone. Deep inside the tunnel networks, Japanese artillery observers recorded the catastrophic results. Through narrow concrete slits, they witnessed entire platoons decimated in seconds, and heavy landing vehicles blown apart as they hit the shoreline. According to the strict tenets of their military doctrine, this level of sudden, concentrated destruction should have triggered an immediate command collapse. An attacking force subjected to this volume of withering, sustained fire should fracture, become permanently pinned down, or immediately retreat to the safety of the sea. They fully expected the American assault to break under the sheer weight of the slaughter. But as the observers continued to watch, the expected collapse never materialized. Instead of withdrawing, the battered Marine formations methodically dug into the loose ash, reorganized under the unrelenting barrage, and slowly began an agonizing, bloody crawl directly forward into the teeth of the defenses. The crawl off the black ash beaches marked the beginning of a combat environment that neither side had fully anticipated. As the Marines pushed inland toward the Motoyama Plateau and the steep slopes of Suribachi, the battle fractured into hundreds of isolated, subterranean nightmares. Japanese officers, monitoring the American advance through periscopes and narrow concrete embrasures, fully expected to see disorganized infantry desperately trying to maneuver in the open, vulnerable to the interlocking fields of fire. Instead, they recorded their first genuine shock of the campaign. The Americans were not simply throwing bodies at the bunkers. They were deploying a methodical, terrifyingly efficient system of tactical eradication, known as blowtorch and corkscrew. Surviving letters from Japanese platoon commanders stationed in the central sector detail the horror of watching this system operate. Rather than massing in the open, Marine combat engineers and infantry assault squads moved with lethal precision. They utilized the blind spots in the Japanese interlocking defenses, creeping up to the reinforced concrete pillboxes under the cover of suppressing fire. First came the blowtorch. Japanese defenders documented the devastating psychological and physical impact of the M2 flamethrowers and modified Sherman tanks equipped with Mark I flame systems. A continuous stream of burning napalm would be directed specifically into the ventilation shafts and firing slits. For the men trapped inside the sealed, windowless bunkers, there was no avenue of retreat. The intense heat instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the confined spaces, effectively suffocating anyone who was not caught in the immediate blast. Then came the corkscrew. While the defenders were blinded, disoriented, or incapacitated by the flames, American demolition teams would rush forward, shoving heavy satchel charges of C4 explosive directly into the embrasures or down the air vents. The resulting detonations would completely cave in the concrete roofs, permanently sealing the pillboxes and burying the remaining occupants alive. In their final dispatches, Japanese junior officers expressed a creeping dread at the relentless mechanical nature of this destruction. Their intricate, layered defenses, which had taken months of grueling labor to carve from the volcanic rock, were being systematically disassembled by combat engineers acting more like exterminators than traditional infantry. The Japanese were achieving their tactical mandate of inflicting casualties, frequently shooting down the highly exposed flamethrower operators and demolition men. But the American squads simply picked up the weapons of their fallen comrades and continued the grim, methodical work without losing momentum. As the days blurred into a continuous, deafening roar of high explosives, a second, profound realization began to permeate the surviving Japanese diaries. It was a deep, paralyzing awe at the sheer logistical supremacy of the United States. In the Imperial Japanese Army, resources were precious. The loss of a single tank, heavy artillery piece, or even a crate of ammunition was a permanent, irreplaceable catastrophe. Because they were entirely cut off from resupply, the Japanese inherently projected this mindset onto their enemy. They assumed that if they could just inflict enough material damage, the American advance would be forced to halt, regroup, and wait for new equipment, buying the defenders crucial time. But as Japanese forward observers tracked the American movements through the jagged ravines, they recorded a reality that defied their military comprehension. A Japanese anti-tank squad hidden in a camouflaged spider hole might successfully ambush and destroy an American Sherman tank, celebrating a hard-fought, high-risk tactical victory. Yet, within hours, another Sherman would simply roll up from the beach to take its exact place. The material wealth of the invasion force seemed entirely disconnected from the physical limits of warfare. Japanese soldiers, surviving on a few ounces of contaminated water and rapidly dwindling rations of rice, rode in disbelief about the endless streams of landing craft constantly unloading onto the beaches, completely ignoring the Japanese artillery fire that was still raining down on them. One verified diary entry from a Japanese non-commissioned officer stationed near Airfield No. 2 captured this logistical despair perfectly. He noted that the American artillery fire never paused. It did not stop for the night. It did not stop for shifting weather. And it never stopped for a lack of shells. The United States Navy kept the island illuminated with a continuous, blinding canopy of star shells, turning the night into a permanent, eerie twilight. This relentless illumination completely denied the Japanese the cover of darkness they desperately needed to launch counterattacks or infiltrate American lines. The underground defenders realized they were not just fighting a military force, they were fighting an industrial conveyor belt. The American supply chain stretched from the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of California across thousands of miles of the Pacific Ocean straight onto the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, and it never stopped moving. No matter how much equipment the Japanese destroyed, the rocky landscape remained choked with American armor, half-tracks, and artillery. However, material supremacy alone could not explain what the Japanese were witnessing. Kuribayashi's entire defensive strategy hinged on the fundamental assumption that while the Americans possessed limitless machines, they lacked the psychological endurance for sustained human slaughter. The Imperial High Command widely believed that Western democracies were inherently weak when forced to pay heavily in blood. But as the battle ground agonizingly into its second and third weeks, the perspective of the Japanese defenders shifted from a strict anxiety over firepower to a grim, terrifying recognition of the American infantry's resolve. Through their narrow observation slits, Japanese commanders saw the gruesome toll their defenses were exacting. They watched Marine companies get reduced to the size of platoons, and platoons reduced to mere handfuls of men. By any conventional military metric, these American units should have been combat ineffective, paralyzed by the horrific losses and the sheer trauma of the subterranean meat grinder. Yet, the Japanese recorded a seamless, highly organized system of replacement and rotation that completely defied their expectations. When a Marine officer fell, a non-commissioned officer instantly stepped up to take command, without waiting for orders from a higher headquarters. When a squad was decimated, fresh replacements were funneled directly into the front lines to maintain the assault. The Japanese watched, often in quiet disbelief, as American medics routinely exposed themselves to relentless machine gun fire to drag their wounded to the rear, while simultaneously, fresh troops stepped right over the stretchers to fill the gaps in the advancing line. The American war machine did not pause to mourn or consolidate. It absorbed the staggering casualties, integrated the replacements directly under fire, and maintained a continuous, unrelenting forward pressure. For a Japanese soldier writing his final letters home, knowing absolutely no one was coming to relieve or rescue him, the psychological weight of this realization was devastating. The garrison was succeeding in its mandate. They were bleeding the Marines white, killing and wounding thousands. But the American system was entirely capable of digesting that trauma. The bloodshed was not breaking the American will. It was simply being factored into the operational tempo. By early March, as the Marine advance pushed into the jagged, broken terrain of the northern sector, the intricate Japanese defense mechanism finally began to fracture. The relentless concussive pounding of naval gunfire and heavy artillery was fundamentally altering the geography of the island, and with it, severing the lifelines of the Japanese garrison. Underground telephone cables, buried deeply to avoid disruption, were vaporized by direct hits from massive 16-inch naval shells. Runners dispatched to carry urgent orders between caves were systematically cut down by American snipers and overlapping machine gun fire. As a result, Kuribayashi's highly centralized, meticulously coordinated defense dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance. Platoon commanders and squad leaders found themselves fighting completely blind, cut off from adjacent bunkers and higher command. They had no clear picture of the overall battle, knowing only the 50 yards of sulfurous rock immediately in front of their cave entrances. In stark contrast, these isolated Japanese units found themselves facing an American combined arms machine that operated with terrifying coordination. Surviving Japanese accounts describe the intense frustration and helplessness of trying to engage an enemy that rarely fought on Japanese terms. If a Japanese machine gun nest opened fire and pinned down a Marine squad, the Americans did not launch a direct, suicidal frontal assault. Instead, they would immediately go to ground and utilize their communication networks. Within minutes, a radio operator would call in precise coordinates. The pinned-down Marines would mark the target with colored smoke, and a coordinated strike would instantly follow. Artillery batteries from the rear, naval destroyers sitting offshore, or Marine Corsair fighter bombers loitering above would saturate the specific bunker with high explosives. Only after the position was utterly pulverized would the infantry move forward. This vast disparity in coordination meant that even when Japanese defenders achieved a perfect tactical ambush, trading their lives to inflict a high number of American casualties, the victory was entirely localized and fleeting. A sealed cave or a destroyed bunker could not be reinforced. The Japanese were fighting a series of disconnected, desperate last stands, while the Americans were executing a unified, highly synchronized symphony of destruction. The defenders had transitioned from underestimating the American resolve to facing the cold, undeniable reality of their situation. Every yard of volcanic rock cost the Americans dearly in blood, exactly as Kuribayashi had planned. But the isolated tactical victories achieved by desperate Japanese squads were being swallowed whole by an endless, surging tide of men, steel, and high explosives. The American system simply routed around the damage, absorbing the horrific attrition and pushing relentlessly northward. As the communication lines went dark and the defensive pockets shrank, the reports trickling back up to the deepest command bunkers forced the Japanese high command to confront a reality far more terrifying than the sheer volume of American artillery. For decades, the popular narrative of this battle has often been reduced to a simplistic clash of absolutes. Blind American heroism throwing itself against fanatical Japanese resistance. But the surviving internal dispatches from Kuribayashi's headquarters reveal a much colder, more analytical despair taking hold. The terrifying reality reaching the deepest command bunkers was not merely that the Americans were unafraid to die. It was that the United States military had engineered a system specifically designed to absorb catastrophic human destruction without stalling. Kuribayashi's entire attrition strategy relied on the assumption that massive, visible casualties would paralyze American command and shatter the assault's morale. Instead, Japanese intelligence officers analyzing the battlefield noted a seamlessly efficient ecosystem of trauma management. They observed a rapid medical evacuation apparatus that fundamentally negated the psychological intent of the Japanese defenses. Specially equipped amphibious tractors and offshore hospital ships acting as floating surgical centers meant that critically wounded Marines were rapidly extracted from the meat grinder. To the Japanese command, who had zero medical resupply and were forced to leave their wounded to perish in the sulfurous tunnels, this was devastating to witness. It meant the American front lines did not clog with the dying. The psychological paralysis that Kuribayashi counted on was being systematically removed from the battlefield. The crushing realization setting in among the Japanese staff was purely mathematical. Their mandated ultimate sacrifice was structurally insufficient to stop a system built to digest massive trauma as a mere logistical variable. This profound intellectual defeat, the understanding that bleeding the enemy would not break the enemy's machine, crystallized just as the physical battle reached its most brutal phase. Driven off the central plateau, the remnants of the Japanese garrison were now being compressed into an inescapable geographic choke point, pushed to the absolute brink of annihilation, with nowhere left to retreat. By mid-March, this brutal compression forced the surviving defenders into the jagged, chaotic ravines of the northern sector, a sprawling maze of stone the Americans dubbed the meat grinder. Inside these final gorges, organized resistance rapidly disintegrated into a primitive, suffocating nightmare. The meticulously planned command structure was gone. General Kuribayashi's unified defense had shattered into hundreds of disconnected subterranean tombs. Without radio contact or surviving runners, isolated squad leaders had no idea if the rest of the island had already fallen. Their entire reality shrank to the few yards of blasted rock just outside their cave entrances. Heavy artillery ammunition was practically exhausted. Japanese infantrymen were reduced to clutching single, scavenged anti-tank mines, waiting in total darkness for the vibration of approaching American armor. Thirst, which had been a chronic agony for months, finally transitioned into a lethal epidemic. With the last rainwater catchments destroyed or overrun, surviving letters describe men driven to absolute delirium, desperately licking faint moisture off the condensation-slicked cave walls. Against this fractured, starving remnant, the United States military unleashed the full, unmitigated weight of its combat engineering. The Americans no longer merely maneuvered around the stubborn defensive pockets, they systematically terraformed the battlefield. Heavily armored bulldozers, operating under covering fire and entirely impervious to desperate rifle shots, simply rolled up to the cave entrances. With mechanical indifference, they pushed massive walls of earth and volcanic ash over the openings, burying the defenders alive and sealing them inside forever. The psychological breaking point recorded in those final, desperate dispatches was not born from a sudden fear of dying. It was the crushing, undeniable realization of ultimate futility. These soldiers had endured months of subterranean torment, executed a brilliantly engineered trap, and successfully inflicted some of the highest casualty rates the United States Marine Corps had ever seen. Yet, as they listened to the endless, mechanical roar of the American supply chain echoing above them, they understood a terrifying truth. Their absolute maximum sacrifice, the total uncompromising expenditure of 21,000 lives, had not delayed the American invasion timetable by a single day. The vast industrial and human wave simply continued to roll forward, washing over the northern gorges and silencing the island's meticulously engineered defense forever. Looking back at the black sands from the shattered observation posts on Suribachi, the surviving Japanese commanders knew they had executed General Kuribayashi's mandate to the letter. They had absorbed the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment in naval history, waited in the sweltering dark, and unleashed a mathematically perfect slaughter. They achieved a staggering, horrific attrition rate, inflicting over 26,000 casualties on the United States Marine Corps. By every metric of traditional defensive doctrine, they had won the battle of annihilation they were ordered to fight. Yet, they were systematically ground into dust. The defenders of Iwo Jima proved that a well-entrenched garrison could exact an unimaginable price in blood. But they also uncovered a terrifying truth about their enemy. American industrial might was not a substitute for human endurance. It was matched by a grim, systemic willingness to absorb catastrophic losses without ever losing forward momentum. The democracy they had been told was too fragile to stomach a protracted slaughter had simply integrated the trauma into its operational tempo. This documented realization echoed far beyond the volcanic ash of the island. When the intercepted dispatches and final after-action reports reached the Imperial High Command in Tokyo, It profoundly altered the strategic calculus for the defense of the Japanese home islands. The conflict resolved into a brutal mathematical certainty. Iwo Jima demonstrated to both empires the horrific, inescapable cost of the Pacific War's final phase. The island had been hollowed out and turned into a fortress of unparalleled lethality, only to be entirely consumed by a military machine that simply refused to stop. The defenders of Iwo Jima sought to break the American will through sheer, unprecedented bloodshed, but instead, they discovered an enemy whose systemic resilience was as unforgiving as the volcanic rock beneath their feet. They engineered a flawless trap for a fragile adversary, only to be crushed by an industrial giant that proved terrifyingly willing to bleed.